to really almost like with a native proficiency. We have got a very interesting morning. What we want to do is we basically want to talk about the context and the reason why we need the information to get on with our lives and also to achieve various sustainable development goals. Before I, in fact, jump into that, let me just tell you that 2015 was a very monumental year for all of us. We concluded a Millennium Development Goal. The other thing, what we did was we started or embarked on a different, development pursuit, and we called it Sustainable Development Goal. But at the same time, we started thinking about a different context for the access to knowledge. And in this year, UNESCO's member state, 196 of them, they decided to declare September 28th of every year to be celebrated as International Day for Universal Access to Information. So today we will be talking about access to information, why it is so important for us and for our lives. In 2016, it was celebrated for the first time, and we celebrated at the headquarters where there were 10 celebrities were present. We talked about the context and the reason why we need access to information. 2017, we moved from headquarters in Paris to Africa, and we talked about why information or access to information is extremely important for the development of Africa. In 2018, we moved from there to Sri Lanka, where we talked about the digital revolution that is going on in Asia and how that is triggering different dynamics for access to information and how it is changing the lives and livelihood of people living in Asia. This year, 2019, we're here in Latin America, and primarily we're talking about two things. One, that we're talking about the context of access to information vis-a-vis policies. The other thing that we're talking about is access to information and taking access to information out of the clutches of the businesses and so forth and make it almost non-commercial. So without further ado, and I've got four very eminent people who are here, and they will provide their perspective on why or what they can contribute for this particular day, the International Day for Universal Access to Information. But at the same time, they will also provide certain. I'll start with you, John. John, in fact, he works for Coalition S, and in fact, he's one of the person behind Plan S. And given the fact that today we are talking about open access, he will provide certain context on what do you think Plan S can contribute to, say, access to information.
Bueno, voy a contestar en español. ¿Funciona? ¿Entienden? Sí, gracias. Bueno, voy a contestar en español. Bueno, la S es una iniciativa de Coalición S, y la Coalición S es un grupo de financiadores de investigación que ha formulado un plan para acelerar la transición al acceso abierto de los resultados científicos. Es formulado como una serie de principios para asegurarse que las personas que reciben fondos de investigación de esos financiadores publiquen todos sus resultados en acceso abierto. Así que hay tres condiciones principales, creo, en en el plan la primera condición es que los investigadores tienen que publicar todos sus resultados en acceso abierto y en revistas que tienen acceso abierto. Así que ya no pueden escoger ellos mismos las revistas en las cuales quieren publicar, pero esas revistas tienen que ser en acceso abierto. También es el caso que la otra condición es que la propiedad intelectual del artículo que se publica tiene que quedar con el autor. Así que no puede haber ninguna cesión de copyright, ninguna cesión de propiedad intelectual de parte del autor hacia las casas editoriales. Eso no es permitido. Y también hay otro principio que estipulamos en el plan S, es que los gastos, los costos de la publicación serán pagados por los financiadores. Otra condición es que la publicación tiene que hacerse por un precio justo y justificado, es decir, que queremos transparencia de costos y de precios de parte de las casas editoriales. Y de esa manera esperamos cambiar el campo de la publicación académica y contribuir a un acceso abierto más amplio. Tenemos que decir que es la primera vez que los financiadores de investigación en el mundo toman esa iniciativa de manera concertada y global. Y queremos que el PLANES y la convención sea global, así que al momento todavía da la impresión que es una iniciativa del Atlántico Norte, como diría mi director de aquí, pero no lo es. Realmente queremos que sea una iniciativa del mundo entero y de los financiadores y del mundo académico del mundo entero para enviar la señal que queremos cambiar el acceso a los datos, el acceso a los artículos y los resultados científicos que después de todo son financiados por nosotros todos. Eso cuadra muy bien, creo, con la iniciativa de la UNESCO de hacer la información más libre y de tratar la información como un derecho humano. Nosotros creemos en planes y en coaliciones que el saber científico realmente es un bien común. Tenemos que tratarlo como el agua, como la electricidad, es decir, un bien común al cual tenemos derecho para un precio justo y relativamente bajo, pero algo que podemos obtener fácilmente y sin obstáculos mayores como los muros de pago. Los muros de pago hay que compararles un poco como al muro de Berlín. No tienen sentido. Hay que eliminarlos cuanto antes. Bueno, eso es mi respuesta breve.
Thank you so much, John. I would, if we define open access for a layman, we can say that this is essentially a knowledge transaction process between and amongst various involved entities, research or funders or citizens or universities and so on. Is it possible to make knowledge transaction process non-commercial? And what are its significance, say, for a concept that the world has taken or has embarked on to strengthen access to information around the world? And how do you think that can be properly addressed? By the way, I did introduce Jean-Claude Guérin because Professor Jean-Claude Guérin is an authority on open access. I think as old open access is, like it's like there is a corollary or a parallel that I can draw between Jean-Claude and open access. It's crazy to think about it, but I'm not going to stop there. He teaches at the University of Montreal.
Thank you very much. Disculpe porque me voy a hablar en inglés. El argumento es demasiado difícil para mí para establecerlo en español. The transaction in the production, circulation, reception, use of knowledge is a strange word in some ways because it already shows the kind of economic basis in it. And I tend to think that humanity, through its history, has simply developed, luckily, a form of what I like to call a great conversation, in which people can exchange, check each other, criticize each other, support each other, share, develop, and so on. And we have bootstrapped ourselves as humanity with knowledge, which little by little has led us to greater and greater capacity to do things with that knowledge, sometimes very bad things, but we have a capacity to do things with that knowledge. So when I'm asked whether something like science or knowledge should be, how could it be transacted, if not commercially, I immediately say, beware. We want to talk about the real thing, which is knowledge, which is exchange of knowledge, production of knowledge, certification of knowledge, and making its movement upward ever more. So what I would like to suggest is that why is it that we raise such a question nowadays in our history? And the reason actually is coming quite clear. In the years that followed the Second World War, something changed radically in the way people held their great conversation. People began to understand that they could do, not people, but publishers began to understand that they could transform the conversation among researchers and among human beings in general by changing the nature of the tools being used to converse. They began to instill instead a spirit of transactions and paying transactions, of course. What happened really is simple. After the Second World War, the pace of research in the world just increased tremendously, enormously. And the usual societies which more or less managed the communities that did science and knowledge, the learned societies, the scientific associations, they just couldn't cope. And for the first time in the history of printing of those conversations, where before the commercial aspect was minimal and marginal, for the first time people in the commercial publishing business saw the door open, and they seized the moment and did it very well. And how did they do that? Well, they did it by managing to mix two questions, two very different questions. How do we make something into a commodity to be fighting on a market to gain market shares? That's one side of the story. And the thing that was being transacted and literally transacted were not scientific ideas, knowledge, or anything like that. It was journals, scientific journals, printed scientific journals, things that you buy and sell. And on the other hand, you had to somehow make this side of the fighting, the competition for the market, coincide with something that fitted the world of knowledge, the world of knowledge production. So you had to somehow say to those who produce the thing, if you play with these journals in a certain way, you're going to be rewarded by having a kind of bonus in terms of visibility, prestige, and etc. And then at that point, what happens is that the journals, instead of being rough pointers to legitimate sources of information, you read an article from the Royal Society, the Académie des Sciences in Paris, or something in Germany, or the Russian Academy of Science in St. Petersburg. You didn't question the journal, you knew it was probably quite legitimate, and you didn't worry about it. It was good enough. But from that point on, the journals began to compete for having some sort of ranking among themselves to be better than each other or lesser than each other. And that ranking took place by something else that came from the side, which was a new tool that was developed in the 70s, and which started tracing how people cited each other in their articles. Out of that, you got a system of rankings by citations of journals, and the myth was that the system of ranking by citations was actually something that coincided with the quality of not only the journals, but the authors within the journals. So I'm not going to give you a whole course now about the whole history of scientific publishing the last 50 years or 70 years, but what I can say is that mixing of a logic, economic logic on the one hand, and intellectual logic on the other hand, was achieved in the 70s and 80s, and that's why we're in this commercial field. So to respond now to your question, the issue is not can we think of it in any other way. The issue is to say how do we get out of a situation which has been invented only recently in human history. It's not something that was invented on the 8th day of creation. So what I'm saying there is that the first thing is that we've got to restore the notions of quality, of excellence, of prestige, of visibility, all these things that make the Peacock researchers very happy. You have to do that on the one hand, but do it in a way that doesn't have to go with an economic mechanism at the same time. And the main lesson, and I'll stop there because I want to leave some time to my colleagues, the main thing to do is, in effect, the culprit in all of this is the present way in which the journal has been changed and commodified since 1975. And the way to change all this is somehow to get back to what journals used to do so well up to 1950, 1960, ever since the Royal Society's Royal Transactions in the 17th century, namely representing communities and allowing the great conversation to move forward well, richly, and without interferences from other logics, such as an economic logic. Thank you.
One of the things that you said is that this knowledge transaction will definitely enhance universal access to knowledge. If this is so, let me just turn to Ariana. Professor Ariana C. works for Redalic and also one of the brains behind ENDALISA, which UNESCO supports, of course. And she's okay. So I'm sorry about that. Professor Ariana, she is one of the brains behind ENDALISA and works for Redalic, and she has been extremely instrumental to change the way, like the knowledge transaction that likely pointed out by John Paul. One of the things here that I have to ask you, Ariana, is this knowledge transaction process requires infrastructure to be put in place. What new infrastructures are needed to support this knowledge transaction process? And who should pay for it?
Gracias. Bueno, respuesta, también voy a hablar en español. Ojalá tuviera la respuesta, pero sí tenemos idea de por dónde quisiéramos ver, o cuál creemos que podría ser una forma más sana de encaminar la solución. Hablando de infraestructura, nosotros cuando pensamos en una infraestructura tal vez pensemos en cosas físicas, en cosas que nos permiten sostener, en este caso por ejemplo un objetivo, que en este caso sería el poder lograr el acceso abierto, el derecho universal al acceso a la información. Sin embargo, la infraestructura se compone de muchas cosas, ¿no? Primeramente, y sin duda estamos en la era digital y necesitamos estar dentro de lo que se conoce como la web y aprovechar las tecnologías de información y comunicaciones para poder realmente alcanzar los objetivos principales que tiene la ciencia. Uno de los objetivos principales es darse a conocer, tener la visibilidad suficiente para poder generar un impacto en la solución de problemas que le aquejan a la humanidad, poder acelerar, mejorar la calidad de vida de la humanidad, el desarrollo de los diferentes países, y una manera de hacerlo es justamente a través del acceso abierto. La infraestructura, si bien, como decía Tim Berners-Lee, la web es una herramienta, es un juguete técnico, en realidad la web también es una creación social. Y la infraestructura debería de componerse de una infraestructura técnica, por supuesto que la sostenga, pero también de una infraestructura que llamemos suave, como el término software, que tiene que ver con principios y que tiene que ver con valores y que tiene que ver con políticas y con un movimiento social detrás de la infraestructura técnica. Entonces, yo visualizaría una infraestructura de una manera integral. Y esa manera integral es, necesitamos tecnologías, porque las tecnologías nos permiten allanar el camino para la visibilidad y para la producción, en este caso particular de las revistas científicas. Necesitamos pensar en que los valores en los cuales debemos sostener la comunicación científica debe ser la equidad, la inclusión, la interoperabilidad, por supuesto, que nos permite precisamente maximizar el uso y la aplicación o la aplicabilidad del conocimiento científico, y también pensar en la participación global de todos en la ciencia, y es ahí cuando nos lleva la infraestructura hacia un modelo no comercial, porque cuando hablamos de un modelo comercial inmediatamente nos salta el tema de la exclusión. Entonces, lo que hemos hecho con Redalic y recientemente con América Redalic es un producto orgullosamente de esta universidad, de todos ustedes, aquí hay muchos alumnos, profesores que son parte de esta universidad, y esta universidad ha sostenido orgullosamente esta plataforma, que ha dado muestra de buscar ese objetivo, de tratar a la ciencia como un bien común y público. Y cuando tratamos la ciencia como un bien común y público y encaminamos la infraestructura en términos técnicamente para sostener la ciencia como bien común, podemos lograr que todos participemos. Y entonces esta infraestructura yo la visualizo un poco bidireccional, es decir, sostenida de manera cooperativa por la comunidad que sostiene la investigación, y aquí no puedo evitar citar al doctor Jean-Claude Guédon, para mí es un orgullo compartir el panel con él, porque justo como él lo menciona, la comunicación científica es una pequeña fracción de toda la generación de conocimiento que se hace dentro de las universidades, y esa pequeña fracción, ponerla en manos de entidades comerciales realmente problematiza, pone barreras, pone otros intereses de por medio que evitan que nosotros como ciudadanos de países con recursos limitados no podamos acceder o no podamos publicar, porque ahora viene el nuevo concepto de pagar por publicar, y a lo mejor vamos a terminar en un modelo en unos 10 años en donde ya vamos a poder acceder, pero no vamos a poder publicar como mexicanos o como profesores de esta universidad, por ejemplo. Entonces, si nosotros pensamos que esa pequeña fracción que se invierte, es decir, el proceso completo de generación de conocimiento está dentro cuenta que estamos con una gran oportunidad de cambiar ese esquema y por eso también me parece sumamente importante que estén las personalidades que están aquí, porque justamente estamos en un momento del acceso abierto en donde podemos cambiar, donde podemos dar pasos firmes hacia algo mejor o hacia sostener lo que ya nos ha venido haciendo daño como sociedad a nivel mundial. Entonces estamos en ese momento y estamos dando la batalla desde esta universidad, desde lo que hemos hecho a lo largo de estos 17 años, justamente luchando por la ciencia como bien común a través de una infraestructura que la ha venido sosteniendo. Y como para finalizar esta idea, quisiera decir, esta infraestructura, si se sostiene por la comunidad, al menos es la única forma que nosotros creemos que es sustentable, sostenible. La publicación científica es una tarea de la sociedad como tal, y es una tarea que América Latina ha hecho muy bien de manera comunitaria. Ha demostrado que la sostiene de manera colectiva y que también beneficia a todos en esa colectividad. En ese sentido, lo que resta para poder tener una infraestructura global sana o más sana respecto a la que tenemos actualmente es poder interactuar de la misma forma con el norte global, el norte del mundo, el norte atlántico, llamémosle como queramos, porque sí estamos trabajando como islas, sí estamos trabajando en América Latina de una forma y en el norte de otra, queramos o no, y si hay un modelo comercial y un modelo sin fines de lucro casi del mismo tamaño, al menos territorialmente hablando, ¿no? Es decir, la mitad del planeta trabaja de una manera y la otra mitad de manera comercial. Entonces, aquí vale la pena, no sé si exactamente, aquí vale la pena preguntarse y yo quisiera también citar a Fox, que Fox es un investigador del acceso abierto, que dice que la discusión de la publicación científica es la discusión del futuro de la academia. Entonces, realmente no le restemos importancia a la discusión del acceso abierto y el futuro de la publicación científica, porque ese es el futuro de cómo vamos a hacer investigación, cómo vamos a acceder al conocimiento, y eso va a incidir en el desarrollo de la humanidad en el futuro. Nos debemos preguntar qué queremos dejar a las siguientes generaciones, qué tipo de planeta queremos dejar, y eso es lo que estamos haciendo también desde esta universidad.
The fourth panelist today is Professor Leslie Chan. Professor Leslie Chan teaches, and he told me yesterday, development economics at the University of Toronto. Professor Chan, Ariana mentioned that the infrastructure that will be needed to advance, whether it's Amelisa or whether it's GO, or the goal of universal access to information. So it looks like for some way this infrastructure is technology dependent. How do you think new technology is changing the context of universal access to information? But do you fear that this new technology will breed new kind of dependencies in the world between North and South, or between poor countries and rich countries, or between those partners who have got the access to infrastructure and there's those who do not?
Thank you. Am I on? Good morning, am I on? Okay. First of all, greetings. This is wonderful to see such a room full of bright, inquisitive faces. You all look like you have a lot of questions. And so, and I'm curious as to how many of you are library science students or computer science students. Hands? Libraries? And so what are most of these audience coming from in terms of disciplines? Communications? Media studies? Yeah? Fantastic, great. Okay, so the question that was put to me is a complicated one, but I want to start off by saying that everything we do these days is mediated by technology. mediation is really the term that those in media studies may be familiar with, that whatever we do today, we have to depend on technology to some extent. I'm speaking, and we have a colleague translating, we have the microphone, we have the headsets to hear me. These are all ways that we access information. The technology allows us to communicate, but to some extent, we also, as we do this, losing information, because translation is never perfect, and sometimes I speak too fast, and sometimes the terms simply do not translate. And so the notion of loss in translation, I think one is we're familiar with. But that loss sometimes, even though it's unintentional, technology is increasingly creating events or opportunities that we're actually losing information by intention. And this has come back to your question about dependency, and I'll explain to you why. One of my professors who passed away, a very well-known professor at the University of Toronto, her name is Ursula Franklin. You could look her up. And she's written a very famous book called The Real World of Technology. I hope it's translated into Spanish. It hasn't. Maybe one of you would do that. But one of the key theses she made was that technology is not simply the kind of tools and gadgets and things that we use. Technology is actually a social practice that is embedded in an institution. That is, technology allows us to do things with each other, for each other, but also to control the flow of information and to control how other people behave and how we want them to behave and so forth. So technologies are extremely powerful tools. And so those who get to design technology have enormous amount of power. But we don't tend to question those technologies and the power behind it. And so Professor Franklin distinguished two types of technology. One she called broadly prescriptive technology. Prescriptive technologies that kind of channel you into doing things in a certain way. I'll give you a simple example. I give you a hammer. Most things will look like a nail. That's the old saying, right? Hammer is designed to do very specific tasks. Your cell phone today, on the other hand, may be broadly under what Professor Franklin classified as the second type of technology, which is more holistic. Technology that allows you to do things that maybe the technology is not initially intended, but allow you to do creative things with it, because the tools is built in such a way that allow the users to be creative with the tools itself, right? So when the first cell phone came out, we were quite free to use all kinds of things. But as cell phones become more developed by the companies themselves, you know that all these apps are coming in. The apps are great in many ways, but the apps are very, very prescriptive in how we are able to access certain things, right? And so we all do Google searches, we all do searches using different apps to connect with people. But when you do a Google search, the search result is highly mediated by the algorithms that are designed by the people in Google. And the algorithm behind these search results, many of us know, many of you know, are driven by a different logic, and that's the logic of how they can make money based on their searches. So they would direct you to search results that are ranked according to who paid for the results and so forth. So the search results that we get are biased by a particular category business model of generating revenue. But we tend not to think about those results as being driven by a particular logic. And we think that our searches allow us to just search freely across different domains, but in fact our search results have already been prescribed by the technology and by the company's business model. And this is relevant to our discussion of open access and business and so forth, because again, none of these are unintentional. Again, we're seeing more intentional design of technology to prescribe how we publish, how we evaluate each other, and how we find things. Now, since we're in a library, and I said technology is social practices embedded in an institution, I'll give an example of biases in the technology that we use in the library. So my university, University of Toronto, is one of the biggest universities in the world, I'd like to say itself. And they spend millions of dollars each year on subscription, and they outsource their search mechanisms of the library, huge catalog, to an outside company, a third-party company. And so I was doing a search last year for particular journal articles that is published in the South African Journal, which is open access. I didn't know it until later. And I was looking for these journals because the topic and the content was very relevant to what I want to find. And through my library catalog, I cannot find it, even though my library paid millions and millions of dollars to many of the commercial databases. So I was kind of frustrated, so I throw into Google in this case. Because I always tell my students, please don't trust Google, trust your library catalog. I couldn't find it in my library catalog, but the first search result when I came off Google in this case, take me to a link to this South African website that houses open access journal. And so I asked my librarians, how come I cannot find this open access journals through my library catalog? And I can find it on the called Open Web. And then we dig a little deeper, and it's the way the library catalog different journals. In this particular case, there's a metadata field called peer review. In this particular instance, the library catalog is, whoever did the cataloging decided this journal was not peer reviewed, even though it was. And so it excluded the inclusion of that journal into our library database. And so I couldn't find it through my library database, even though it's an open access journal, freely accessible or not. The moral of that story is that, again, there are intentions for people to design the tools, in this case, metadata that are embedded in these fields, lead to me unsuccessful in finding this article. Technology mediate what we see and what we don't see. And how we intentionally or unintentionally design these technologies and how biases creep into these technologies affects the way we see the rest of the world and who we think are important or not important. And I'll conclude with one final example that Jean-Claude alluded to about the citation, indexing, and so forth. One of the most powerful technology in the last 30 years or so is this thing called the journal impact factor. Again, you don't tend to think of it as a technology, but if you follow Professor Franklin's definition of technology as social practices embedded in an institution, journal impact factor is a form of technology to design to make visible certain things and make invisible many other things. So the journal impact factor were index journals that are published in certain high-ranking journals. It will index mostly English language journals, so many of the Spanish language journals were excluded. And many other languages from around the world were excluded, and of course certain subjects were privileged over others. And so this technology privileged what people find and privileged what certain knowledge is then considered more important, more prestigious, and so forth. Right? Technology mediates access to knowledge and to access to information. So the notion of universal access is, to me, a bit of an idealism. Right? It can be achieved, but it can only be achieved if we are all intentional about the tools that we design. So I implore you that the future of the world to think about design and technology, if you're involved in any way, and about questioning the kind of technology that we have. And I'm very thankful that America and Ariana, they are thinking very thoughtfully about the kind of infrastructures and the technology that would allow us to see a lot of the things that would otherwise be unseen in the existing world of technology. So,
Thank you so much, honestly. That was very insightful. At the same time, that raised a couple of new questions. If the entire notion for, say, for example, for Melissa to develop would be to free information that currently exists behind the paywall. And now, John, I have to ask you, how can Plan S, because it's a set of principles, of course, how the knowledge can be free. How can Plan S help, say, for example, Melissa? I'm sorry, I got you.
gastos asociados con la publicación directamente, lo que se llama el ABC, Article Processing Charge. Eso sí se puede contribuir. Es mucho más difícil, o por lo menos los financiadores del norte, por lo menos los financiadores de coaliciones, consideran que es mucho más difícil sostener o apoyar a infraestructuras. Bueno, que a mí me parece una lástima, porque no es lo que resulta de las infraestructuras de momento. Es mucho más fácil para los financiadores de contribuir en función de cada artículo que se publica bajo su supervisión. Eso es una manera fácil de contribuir. Así que tenemos que, tal vez, que haya manera de contribuir a la jerarquía en ese sentido, en una manera de artículo por artículo. Otra manera en la cual podemos contribuir, creo, como coalición es desarrollando una red global para ayudarse mutuamente. Ya he hablado con Eduardo y Ariana sobre el hecho que en el Atlántico Norte también hay problemas con ciertas revistas. Por ejemplo, las revistas nacionales que se publican en lenguas nacionales como el noruego, el sueco, el serbo-croato. Estas revistas no les interesan a las clases editoriales del todo. Son pequeñas revistas nacionales y tienen muchas dificultades para publicarse en el día de hoy porque no tienen acceso a infraestructuras que son de países bastante pequeños, y en eso creo que la podría ser un ejemplo de cómo se hace, cómo se puede utilizar esa infraestructura de manera más global. Sé que lo mismo es el caso para ciertas revistas en América del Norte que tampoco han atraído el interés de las casas editoriales. Así que creo que puede haber una conversación más global sobre la manera de la cual podemos solucionar los problemas. A mi parecer, y eso contesta la pregunta que me mostraste hace un momento, a mi parecer hay tres maneras que me parecen prometedoras para el porvenir de la aplicación. Una es relativa que hace a mí, es decir, poner las infraestructuras y clavarlas en la comunidad académica. Eso me parece muy importante, porque es verdad que eso llega a apoyar la distribución de conocimiento sin otra manera que conozco, con la cual tengo cierta experiencia, es la de la Open Library of Humanities, que es un consorcio de bibliotecas que opera en el Reino Unido, y su manera de trabajar es un poco diferente de la mía, pero tiene la misma idea, es que la diseminación académica del conocimiento tiene que ser vinculada con las bibliotecas. Así que en ese caso la idea es que son las bibliotecas que utilizan sus medios que antes utilizaban para suscripciones, que utilizan ese financiamiento para sostener la publicación de artículos. Por ejemplo, mi revista, es una revista de lingüística que hizo yo, es apoyado por el pagamento de los APCs por la Open Library of Humanities, que también tiene muchas otras. También es una manera no comercial de distribuir el conocimiento, y es otra manera de dedicar, también me parece un modelo interesante. La tercera manera que conocemos y es la cual escuchamos. El objetivo de Planes es discutir con las casas editoriales y hacerles más justos. Es un objetivo tal vez un poco idealista, pero no podemos hacer como si las casas editoriales que tienen el poder hoy no existieran. Existen y tenemos que trabajar con ellas y ver cómo podemos renegociar nuestra relación con ellas. Y eso es el objetivo de Planesa. Pero eso no quiere decir que no queremos colaborar con otras maneras de mover, además del acceso a medios, esperamos poder hacer eso, porque todos tenemos el mismo objetivo, es decir, hacer que el acceso a los conocimientos sea inmediato, sin un pago, y accesible para todos, y que los autores guarden su propiedad intelectual, y que eso no sea transferido a las casas editoriales.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. And now I'd like to jump up first. There are several students, sitting in the room, and they're from the Faculty of Media and Communication, they're from the Faculty of Library Sciences, and also from the Faculty of Communication. All of them must have heard about knowledge commons. I know that you're also a big sort of you promote knowledge commons around here, promote knowledge commons around the world. How do you see development of knowledge commons in the future, in the post, say, Plan S? But I've got a follow-up question to that one. How do you think this knowledge commons be strengthened, both in terms of production, dissemination of information? Because I'm simply trying to bridge this existing gap between what Plan S is doing and what maybe International Day for Universal Access is trying to do. So maybe you can try to help us with that.
Thank you. This will allow me, in fact, to comment a little bit on what Johan just said. I think the hesitations and I would say ambivalence, I think, of Johan in his own answer actually reflects something very, very interesting and important, which is we've talked about how technology affects our life world. Printing and digital technologies affect our life world in many ways, and we're in fact at the juncture in which we see solutions which have been established through a certain channel which I date around the 70s to now, which is the commercial route that we deal with. And we see the other juncture, which is in the, let's say, to speak quickly, the general vision of Redalic, which starts with saying the present commercial system is creating a number of distortions, as will always happen if a technology, as has been pointed out, has been designed to distort things themselves. So I would say that the problem of Plan S, and to go beyond to go to knowledge commons, which should be the ultimate, is perhaps to do two things. One, to do what they do right now, which is simply negotiating with the existing dominant power as a transitional period, not as an objective forever, but as a transitional period. Okay, we're going to try and keep the publishers at bay for a while. We're going to try and keep them under certain, tell them to behave a little bit, and so on. But meanwhile, and that's what I don't see very much in Plan S yet, would be developing really a roadmap for the ultimate vision, which would be the knowledge commons, and where entities such as Redalic become absolutely crucial players. So that means what we have facing at that point is a clear vision of a landscape in which one part of the landscape acts as an obstacle to the great conversation in its optimal behavior, in its optimal development, and a part of the landscape that tries to promote this great conversation. And then you have to position yourself in between those two options and find your strategy to arrive where you want to get. It is therefore ultimately a political question. Do you want to keep the powerful entities that are acting and directing the system in front of us right now in that position, and you're just going to try and take them a bit, which is what, or maybe even a great deal, but I want to see how it's going to be, and or do you want to change things? And for the transitional period, speaking now to Plan S, not necessarily to Johan, because I think he thinks beyond Plan S. I've known Johan for a while now, and I know where he stands, and I like it. The problem, I think, with the Plan S principles and points is that, to go back to my first intervention, is that the nature of the journal has not been addressed squarely. The journal, as offered as a commodity by the publisher, remains central to, it's not criticized, let's say, in the ways in which Plan S is trying to go forward. Now, we could then see how to develop a knowledge commons and how to do it. And during the breakfast, we had a very interesting discussion with some colleagues from Colombia and Argentina, and we were discussing about what Redalyc is and what else could be acting up to help Redalyc. And I'm throwing an idea at you in general. Redalyc is pretty well a top-down sort of organization, which has, with its centrality and its standards and its professionalism and its tools, has established some extremely important, I would say, bearing points for the whole future. And I think that is presently the great strength and great value for Redalyc. A colleague of ours from the OCLC, Lorcan Dempsey, threw out several years ago another idea, which he calls the Inside Out Library. Now, the Inside Out Library is called that way because what you do in the library normally is to collect things from the outside and bring them inside. In an Inside Out Library, you collect the stuff inside and then you go outside. Liège in Belgium has done a policy, has implemented a policy which essentially says to the researchers and all those that publish that if you want to be evaluated in our institution, we'll look only what's in the depository. So obviously the depository filled up rather radically, in fact, where Liège used to think they produced 2,000 articles a year, they suddenly discovered that they were producing 3,500, just as an example of the policy. Now, if you start with this idea of libraries collecting the production of the local communities, which is very good in itself, but insufficient. If you go to the next stage, which is you network these libraries together so that they begin to offer a sort of one-stop shopping point for all these collected items of work in these universities. And if at that point, those libraries speak to Redalyc and say, look, we're having all sorts of documents in all kinds of formats, we don't know what to do with them, we don't know how to project them outside, we don't know how to make this thing really worthwhile for the researchers and the great conversation in our region and for the world. Can you help us? Then you have the idea of a junction between the two levels, which would both reinforce the efforts of the libraries and Redalyc or America, the case may be. That would be my sort of general, very general, the devil is in the details, obviously, very general perception of how perhaps we could begin moving towards a commons, of knowledge commons, and how something like Plan S, with its powerful junction of many funders could then spend some of their efforts not only to try and do the responsible principles, but move to that level where some critical questions are really addressed and not just sort of said, well, we deal with what is and we don't want to think about what ought to. That would be my very brief take on this issue. Thank you.
Jean-Claude provided a very interesting scenario that maybe Red Lake and America could jointly take. If you see Emelisa or Emelica 10 years from now, where do you see it and what do you think would it be moving them? Maybe all some of us will be tired, but what will you be? What will America be 10 years from now?
Depende. Depende de los pasos que se den ahora. Eso es importante. ¿Cómo veo a América o a Red Lake en 10 años? Depende justamente de las decisiones que se tomen ahora. En muchos aspectos y en muchos sentidos. Yo visualizo, en Red Lake visualizamos 3 caminos importantes que si no se toman en este momento, en 10 años, estas iniciativas podrían no existir. Uno creemos, y voy a hablar un poquito de ello, y hablemos del tema del prestigio. El prestigio es una estrategia o un mecanismo que ha permitido convertir el conocimiento científico en un producto. Eso es lo que lo ha permitido que sea comercializado. Mientras el prestigio siga montado en las corporaciones comerciales, difícilmente hay futuro para los no comerciales, porque toda la industria de incentivos y lo que hemos hablado en estos últimos días, evaluación de la ciencia, y si alguno de ustedes como estudiantes quiere probablemente ser un investigador que compita por una plaza en esta universidad, pues va a ser evaluado por ese tema del prestigio, de las revistas que se consideran de prestigio. Y esta universidad y muchas en el mundo no consideran a Red Lake o América un sistema que merezca tener prestigio. Y no lo hacen porque Red Lake, las revistas que están en Red Lake o en América no tengan calidad, sino lo hacen por una inercia o un llamado efecto Mateo. Y el efecto Mateo en la ciencia ha sido sumamente perjudicial. El efecto Mateo es una revista que más prestigio consigue, pues más recursos va a tener y más contribuciones va a tener, de tal forma que siempre seguirá siendo la que tiene más prestigio. Ese efecto Mateo aplicado al contrario, o a la inversa, hace que Red Lake esté en absoluta desventaja y que sea considerado en algunos países, como por ejemplo en Brasil, como por ejemplo en Colombia, sí se ha considerado con ciertos puntos para un investigador o para una persona que quiere crecer en la academia, pero como un segundo nivel, porque en el primer nivel está Scopus y Web of Science. Y entonces, y en algunas universidades o en algunos consejos nacionales ni siquiera existe para la evaluación científica, no es considerado. Y ese es por el efecto Mateo. Mientras no haya una deconstrucción, citando a Eduardo Abrazo, del sistema de prestigio, un desmantelamiento del sistema de prestigio, y eso sí está en manos de las instituciones, y sí está en manos, no está en manos de Red Lake, desafortunadamente, ni está en manos de América, está en manos de los financiadores, está en manos de los que establecen políticas públicas, está en manos de las autoridades de las universidades que centran los sistemas de incentivos en ese mito del prestigio y no reparan en el daño que se hace al no considerar adecuadamente la calidad de las publicaciones, porque la calidad no es lo mismo que el prestigio y la excelencia, como ya decía el ejemplo. Entonces, mientras no se desmonte, y ese es uno de los 3 ejes que yo visualizo, mientras un auto y hay una marca de autos que nos vende un auto por el mismo precio, mucho más equipado y con muchas más potencia y caballos de fuerza y comodidades, pues por el mismo dinero vamos a comprar el auto que nos ofrecen. Sin embargo, en las revistas científicas no sucede eso. En las revistas científicas no existe el tema de la sustitución. Es decir, cuando yo quiero publicar en una revista científica, así me cueste más caro, yo lo voy a pagar. ¿Por qué? Pues porque estoy siendo obligada como investigadora a publicar en ese lugar. Así encuentro una revista equiparable. Por ejemplo, en América Latina tenemos unas excelentes revistas, de la Revista Mexicana de Sociología. Si un investigador decide publicar en esta revista, pues primero va a ver cuál le va a costar o cuál le va a dar más puntos o incentivos en el Sistema Nacional de Investigadores y va a elegir probablemente la que esté mejor posicionada. Así le resulte más caro comprar ese auto, lo va a comprar y va a evitar comprar el auto que era más barato o que incluso es gratis, ¿no? Porque no se cobra por publicar en las revistas de América Latina. ¿Por qué? Pues por el hecho justamente del prestigio. Entonces el tema de la no sustitución, la capacidad de sustitución de las publicaciones científicas es algo también que puede ser solucionado o al menos definir estrategias por parte de los financiadores y de las universidades para poder evitar, es decir, identificar revistas de calidad. ¿Cuál es el problema del Elsevier o que nos causa Elsevier? Hay revistas que es la única revista en la cual puedes publicar en cierto campo científico. Yo soy del área de cómputo y de inteligencia artificial y para que yo publique en una revista que el Sistema Nacional de Investigadores cuente o que esta universidad cuente, tengo que publicar en una revista forzosamente que me va a cobrar la tesis, porque no hay una revista equivalente en este campo específico. En otros campos sí las hay en América Latina, pero en este campo específico es muy difícil. Sin embargo, hay revistas que van en ese camino y sí podrían ser identificadas claramente, reforzadas, endosarle el prestigio que tiene la misma revista en Springer o en Elsevier y tener opciones y brindarle opciones a la comunidad científica para que pueda publicar en una u otra opción y de esa manera también se le resta poder a las editoriales comerciales porque se le están dando productos alternativos a la comunidad científica para publicar. No solamente es el tema de pero tengo el dinero, sino también yo voy creando productos alternativos, carros alternativos para que puedan ser comprados por la comunidad científica. Y tercero, el tema de la infraestructura. Las iniciativas sin fines de lucro no son gratuitas, no se sostienen por arte de magia. Y esta universidad ha hecho un gran esfuerzo en sostenerse de allí por muchos años, pero tampoco es la función 100% de una sola universidad. Por eso surgió América, porque América es una institución que sí permite integrar a otras universidades para sostener de manera colectiva la infraestructura. Entonces, si no hay inversión organizada y dirigida a las iniciativas sin fines de lucro, si no hay el desmantelamiento del sistema de prestigio y si no hay mecanismos de creación de productos que sustituyan a los productos de prestigio, si no están estas tres condiciones, al menos de lo que yo puedo visualizar en este momento, yo no le veo un futuro después de 10 años a este par de iniciativas.
Leslie, we seems to have a small problem in the sense that Ariane seems to have some doubts, and this doubt needs to be cleared. Cleared in one, and I say that you helped us develop UNESCO's open access strategy, which is still functioning very well. So I thank you for that. So now I think I have to ask you that if you will have to suggest a couple of points to UNESCO or to planners or to other stakeholders out there to help support America continue beyond say 10 years that the time that we in fact put forward, which will make any initiative sustainable for eternity. So tell us, what would be those 3 or 4 things that UNESCO should start doing, planners should start doing, so that America, as a non-commercial open access initiative
unfortunately, I don't think we have managed to live up to that when we have let the commercial entities continue to take over. And I would say that this is to a large extent the neglect of the government agencies that are responsible for overseeing infrastructure. They don't understand what infrastructures are. They think that there are certain things like roads and bridges are infrastructures. But they forget that the most powerful knowledge infrastructures are the people themselves. You are the social infrastructure. The capacity to do things and to then create technology that are appropriate for your circumstance is really what's most important. But we have we've been neglectful of these kind of social infrastructure building. And so what you have really, a lot of your strength here in Latin America and Mexico in general, is this tremendous wealth of young people, older people who are knowledge holder, but whose knowledge are not being sufficiently applied to the problems themselves, right? And so when you talk about knowledge commons, we tend to think about the sort of legitimized, codified knowledge of the journals and the books. One of my colleagues, Bud Hall and Rajat Tandor, they run a network at the UNESCO chairs of community university engagement. And they keep reminding different organizations that 99% of knowledge are situated outside of the universities, outside of books and journals. Your grandmother is a knowledge holder. Your communities in which they live in that community, those are the people that live in the communities are the knowledge holder. And so we're not valuing enough the kind of knowledge that are existing around us and how to work together with the right social infrastructure to get the knowledge to solve the problems that most communities face that are local in nature. We think that somehow the journals that are being written from somewhere is going to have solutions for the problems that we have locally, and that never worked, right? And so, the idea of open access, I would say, has to move well beyond the journals and the books even to social infrastructure. Because I think the danger, what we see now, is that not just the content are being enclosed, is that increasingly technical infrastructure are being enclosed. And yesterday when we talked about how these platforms are being built by the very powerful company to be able to control from the beginning to the end of the production to the evaluation, and to kind of lock in many, many institutions, not only in the global north, but increasingly in the global south through this prestige mechanism. That enclosure is something that we didn't anticipate when we were talking about open access 10, 15 years ago. And I think we have to be more thoughtful about infrastructure and to know about how social infrastructure has to be part of that investment, and to educate funders about why they have to invest in infrastructure, not just invest in the products themselves. And the products, this is where commodifications takes place. But infrastructures shouldn't be commodified. Infrastructure should be the commons that the government helps support and the community help build. And to that extent, Plan S is almost antithetical to the commons in the sense that they allow the enclosure of the infrastructures and the commodifications of the products and knowledge through this article-focused model. Right? Sorry to be so critical, but I think in the context of the differences, we have to realize these are very different ideological assumptions about what constitutes knowledge. And I think we need to, when we talk about open access, be thoughtful about not limiting it to a very small section of knowledge production.
Thank you. Now I'm going to open the floor for a few questions from the floor. And I think if you think about your question, but I think John has, a small point to make.
Yes. No, me gustaría decir que, bueno, ¿me pueden entender? Me gustaría decir que estoy totalmente de acuerdo con Mariana sobre el tema del prestigio. Y Planes quiere cambiar la comunicación, porque es verdad que los financiadores pueden cambiar la comunicación sobre ese tema. Por eso han añadido en el principio
Thank you, Zan. I have a question from and please also tell who do you want to ask the question.
Ok, mi pregunta va para todos. Pensando como desde la perspectiva de los investigadores jóvenes, ¿no? Creo que se ha dado mucho de la infraestructura, pero del otro lado están las prácticas, los hábitos, las cosas que valoramos, los valores o los principios. Entonces, desde la perspectiva de los investigadores jóvenes, ¿qué nos toca hacer? ¿No? Por ejemplo, ayer Thomas Mitchell decía ese momento de decidir, de tomar una postura, de asumir hacia qué lado tenemos que ir, ¿no? Entonces, esa es mi pregunta para todos. Porque en gran medida elegimos nuestra carrera porque creemos que en gran medida más bien es nuestra decisión para cambiar el mundo, ¿no? Pero llegamos a la academia y entonces pensamos que queremos hacerlo, pero institucional o estructuralmente se nos dice pública en una revista de cualquier uno o dos, ¿no? Y entonces decimos, pero esa no es la manera que yo quiero cambiar el mundo, ¿no? Entonces, o esa no es mi manera en la que voy a cambiar o voy a aportar a la Agenda 2030 o los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Entonces mi pregunta es, desde la perspectiva de los investigadores y sobre todo desde los investigadores jóvenes, ¿qué nos toca hacer desde este ámbito académico? Gracias.
Okay, so I have, over the years, I have the privilege of working with many students. Some of them gone on to further studies with master's and PhD, but many of them also went on to work with different community organizations, NGOs, and government agencies. They can help government agencies with understanding policy better from a different perspective, from a non-market-based perspective, from a different economic perspective. Recently, we're talking about the ethics of care, a care economy, what a care economy looks like, and what should policymakers think about. How about our food system is completely unsustainable. We're going to destroy our world through the current food system. How can we do better with an alternative way of supplying our food and have food sovereignty about the kind of food that we want to cultivate and eat and so forth. So there are many things that young people can help do. And university is not the only venue where you can do that. In fact, university is a very prescriptive institution where the kind of things that they tell you to do in terms of journals and so forth is not going to help change the world, unfortunately. And I can tell you another honest secret that we don't generally tell people outside of the university. A very small percentage of people with PhD get a permanent job in the university. And Erin there is nodding her head there. And you are lucky enough to be the 1% to get a job in the university. Then you have to value what you have already achieved, and you then follow the rule of the institution. And you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to do anything different. So you become one of them, right? And so if you want to really be able to make a difference, think broadly, again, beyond the university, beyond the journal and the books. There are so many communities that are in need of people that can help them do research. Research is not just for university. Research is a right, and one of my colleagues up in Durham talk about the rights for research. It's the people's ability to ask questions that are important to them, not what is important to the funder or the university researcher, right? What's important to the community, and what problems do they want to address through research? You can help them with that, and you will make a difference with that, because you will have a real impact in the social system that they live, right? So that's one of my recommendations, and there are lots of opportunity for that, right? And many of my students are doing exactly that. I'm very proud of them.
Yes,
I'd like to get back on the same to the problem of a young researcher who presumably is within a standard academic framework. My first advice, if I may be so bold, would be to say to the student, do no harm to yourself. The first thing is you're caught in a game. Incidentally, this is going to allow me to give a little interesting answer to Manet's dilemma, which is the issue of academic freedom. What academic freedom really means in the voice of those who express it is I want to have the choice to publish where I want in some journal. What they really mean is that I want to remain a slave to the impact factor rules in order to put my article in the highest impact factor journal. Now, as a young researcher, there is very little you can do against that. You're very vulnerable. You don't have the prestige and do no harm to yourself. That would be my thing. I used to say when I was a bit younger, now I can say it even more easily, let the old farts take the needed risks. Okay? That doesn't mean you cannot do anything. I think some of the suggestions that we gave you are interesting. But just to start within your own milieu. How many of your colleagues in the university really understand the political economy of scholarly publishing, for example? How many professors do you meet that don't understand it either? How many administrators do you cross paths with, maybe in a student administration committee, where suddenly you discover they don't understand it either? So educate yourself into this whole field and become a strong voice in your own community there. Then carry it out, if you can, to other communities, to be sure. This is very good. But do no harm to yourself, please. Because what's going to happen if you do is that you will perhaps get one moment of celebrity for 10 minutes, and then the rest of your life you'll have wasted a very big chance. If you work your way into that research system, but you keep your compass with you, including your moral compass, that's the important thing, your moral compass, then you'll have much more influence in the end, and you'll be able to become an old fart yourself.
Another question.
Rápidamente, eres parte de Reverie, ya estás diciendo.
Any other question? Any other question from the floor? We had such a rich discussion. Should be many other questions.
Buenos días. Para empezar, es importante hacer notar lo que se comentó en el inicio, que es que la universidad es solo un pequeño fragmento de la sociedad en donde se puede crear un impacto. En eso estoy completamente de acuerdo, pero creo que es importante, aún así, el hacer hincapié en que de ahí surgen los líderes, surgen las personas que más adelante van a tomar las decisiones para el resto de las generaciones venideras. Por supuesto, como intento de investigador en estos momentos, porque todavía no estoy ni siquiera en el campo, hay poco que puedo hacer como parte de la producción académica, pero sí pretendo, o sí esperaría que respondieran la parte de qué puedo exigir también, no solo mi universidad, sino mi gobierno como ciudadano, para que fomenten este tipo de prácticas, porque al final de cuentas de nada me sirve tener una universidad altamente educada acerca del acceso abierto si mi sociedad no sabe absolutamente nada de qué es este movimiento del acceso abierto, si mis gobernantes son ignorantes por completo de qué es de lo que se trata este tema. Entonces, creo que lo más importante ahorita, independientemente de si somos parte de la academia o si no lo somos, es saber dónde exigir, cómo exigir y a quién exigir. Entonces, para lograr alcanzar los objetivos de la Agenda 2030, los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, a final de cuentas es importante que no solo como académicos trabajemos, sino también que trabajemos como sociedad todos unidos. Gracias.
Eso es más un comentario que una pregunta, tienes toda la razón, pero tenemos que influenciar los financiadores, los partidos políticos, el gobierno, cuando pueda, cuando podamos. Y hay que eso también es lo que quise decirte a ti ayer. Puedes organizarte con otros estudiantes en la universidad o en el país también para influenciar los sectores. En mi caso, por ejemplo, una de las personas que trasladé la revista Lingua Anglosa, que es una revista de exposición en la revista de Access fue porque mis jóvenes me dijeron, yo formo parte del juego de ser brillante, quiero hacer para y entonces esto me puso, eso me empujó a reflexionar sobre mi papel en la edición académica, por fin. Siempre hay manera de conversar con el lector y no sé, en un inicio de la revista del partido, y decirle, ¿qué razones tiene usted para responder? Podemos hablar de eso.
I want to quickly respond to this young man's very thoughtful comment. And so earlier, Andrew asked me about open access, what would we do differently? I think one of the things that we haven't done well is build coalitions. And to build political coalitions, and as we've all agreed, these are not just technical issues or business issues, these are political issues, is what kind of society do we want, right? What kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want society to be governed by business? Or do we want society to be governed by common values and democratic systems, right? Do we want to be happy or do we want to be rich, right? I mean, these are not untrivial. Sometimes we sacrifice happiness for wealth, right? Unfortunately, right? I think we have to ask ourselves these questions, and that's why part of when Ariana asked me to come down, I said, of course I'll come down, because this is what we need, the coalition. Even though Europe may be a little bit far off in terms of how they understand the same, we need to come to some common ground, and we need to build a kind of coalition. We want to make it a political issue, so politicians don't talk about these in the election time. How do we get that into their agenda? How do we make it part of the debate in political arena? Right? So you could help do that if you could, you know. But I want to qualify what I said earlier. I'm not trying to say academia is not important, that we should just give up on academia. I'm just saying that academia, it is very much, you know, fixed in certain tradition. And it's much harder to change within academia than it is outside, because the outside world is where we live in as well, not just academia. So I'm not by any means saying we shouldn't be focusing on what we need to do within academia. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. But also, I'd like to echo what Joel said about do no harm. And it's not only about do no harm to yourself, but do no harm to the communities that you work with. Right? And I don't, you know, lightly set students out to work with the communities. That's why we make sure students are well trained, well understood, and work with the community and let the community tell us what they want to have, understand their value before we work with them. Right? So the idea is to do no harm.
Just a very small point in reaction to Johan's talking to the editors of journals. In the first quarter of journals, the problem is that it's not just we want open access, it's what kind of open access do we want? And for this reason, I would say maybe it's wiser to limit your intervention to journals from learned societies and scientific associations that are probably more ambivalent about the commercial nature of their work than the journals that are deeply steeped in the commercial world. I know some commercial associations, the American Medical Society is a very good example of it, act very commercially, but they still have somehow some of the ideals of the learned societies. If you pay on the values that make them give bursaries, support students, and all that, with the gains from the other thing, from the journal and the publishing, you may be more able to convince them to go into the right kind of open access, rather than just do open access at the price.
Y un complemento rápidamente. Hay que llevar el mensaje. Alejandro es uno de mis estudiantes. Como siempre les digo, hay que llevar el mensaje. Toca y tocar puertas todo el tiempo, ¿no? Entonces, incansablemente, así es, ¿no? Te pongo un ejemplo, lo que decía Les, retomando el tema de las bibliotecas. Cuando su biblioteca no tenía acceso a una revista de acceso abierto, ¿no? Nuestra biblioteca en la universidad donde estamos ahora no tiene Redalic como base de datos en su colección. Nuestra universidad no considera Redalic una fuente para publicar a los investigadores los incentivos por publicar en Redalic. Algunas gestiones, algunos años lo ha hecho y después no, y así. Entonces toca cada vez que viene a tocar la puerta de la nueva persona, de la nueva autoridad, y decir, se te está olvidando, entre otras cosas. Toca hacerlo incansablemente, al menos sin desanimarse, y cuestionarse todo el tiempo si realmente cuando tú entras a tu biblioteca y identificas que no encuentras lo que quieres encontrar, y tú lo sabes, pues cuestiónalo, habla, levanta la voz y esto no es lo que debería de ser. No hay más.
¿Ya? Como aquí la mayor parte de los que están son de aquí, de esta universidad, yo soy de Colombia y voy por toda América Latina. Y Redalic para América Latina es realmente un faro, o sea, un punto de referencia, donde no existiera Redalic. Y es más, qué pena, yo se los he dicho a Eduardo y a Ariana, la UAM no existiría para el continente. Ustedes cuentan bien, pero existen porque existe Redalic. A mí hay cosas que me sorprenden y es eso, o sea, no puedo creer. Estaría absolutamente orgulloso de tener un proyecto como este, que es un faro para todo el continente. O sea, yo me sentiría feliz trabajando en Redalic, pues incluso yo trabajo por Redalic, usted ya sabe, pero cuando tú vas a lugares en Bolivia, en Ecuador, en Colombia, es que en Colombia mi universidad es una universidad de élite, tiene recursos para las bases de datos, pero tiene a Redalic dentro de sus bases de datos como referente. Porque si queremos acceder al conocimiento que se produce en América Latina, a veces no lo encontramos en esas bases, lo encontramos en Redalic. Entonces, el tema es, sí me parece que lo que se ha dicho aquí es interesante porque ni los jóvenes ni los que somos viejos tenemos una opción distinta a insistir y no desfallecer, porque no tenemos alternativa. A mí me asusta que desapareciera un proyecto como Redalic, porque el costo, yo he hablado con algunas personas de México de otros lados, digo, pero ¿cómo los mexicanos no se sienten? No esta universidad, los mexicanos van a perder un patrimonio cultural, porque es que saben que se guardan las bases de datos y el conocimiento no es la genética, es el código cultural de nuestras sociedades, y lo vamos a perder si se pierde Redalic. Y yo no sé quién va a pagar el costo político en esta institución si eso llega a pasar, porque alguien tiene que pagarlo. O sea, es una vergüenza que el rector o las autoridades de aquí no estén dándole todo el apoyo a un proyecto que tiene trascendencia internacional y que lo hicieron ustedes posible, porque esto no se hizo en el aire, lo hicieron el esfuerzo de gente que está aquí, que trabaja todos los días y en ocasiones, yo lo sé, con las uñas. O sea, que han tenido un liderazgo, un proyecto que pesa demasiado para el mundo. A mí me encanta que esté aquí UNESCO, me encanta que esté Planes, me encanta. O sea, uno no tiene todos los días un montón de gente internacional diciendo, oiga, esto es un proyecto aquí, este proyecto ganó un premio internacional. Yo no sé esta institución si se da cuenta de lo que significa, pero, o sea, tiene un tema de reconocimiento que el costo, ¿quién va a pagar? A mí me preocupa eso. En esta institución y en este país, porque eso lo debe discutir Claxo y las instituciones mexicanas, si llega a desaparecer. Porque eso es un costo para todo el continente, claro, el continente debe pensarse formas de financiarlo. Pero yo les digo a ustedes, si ustedes que están aquí no se mueven lo que deben mover en esta institución para que este proyecto, que es un proyecto bandera, modelo para el continente y para el mundo, porque aquí hemos hablado de que este proyecto puede desbordar no solamente este continente, sino es una puerta, una forma que es posible hacer el conocimiento, hacer que ese conocimiento tenga otras formas de ser pensado, otras formas de ser visibilizado. Así que yo no era una pregunta, era un comentario que me asusta, en serio, y que ese comentario que se dijo aquí, el joven de atrás, es ese tema de la injerencia en la política, no solamente en la política hacia los políticos y hacia la sociedad, sino en la propia institución y la propia universidad. Cómo los estudiantes y los profesores se mueven para defender este proyecto, porque es su proyecto. Es su proyecto. Y ojalá que alguien pague el costo político por no fortalecer ese proyecto como institución, porque nosotros nos vamos de aquí y seguramente vamos a querer y estamos buscando apoyos de todo tipo para el proyecto. Pero ¿quién tiene que finalmente, quién va a decir, oiga, no fueron capaces? La OAM. Así va a pasar. Eso es lo que va a pasar con el resto del mundo. Van a decir, ¿qué fue lo que pasó en la OAM? No van a decir en el aire. Así que pienses, perdona, si no, yo soy políticamente incorrecto en general, entonces...
Thank you so much. That was very passionate call to preserve the institution of Italy as well as America. So thank you so much for voicing that opinion. I think that from our part, we'll definitely take that message and I'll take it forward. But I think we've almost come to the end of the panel discussion. So before we actually end, if there is one thing that upcoming IDUAI or International Day for Universal Access to Information must announce within the broader domain of open access, what will it be? Just one key things that upcoming IDUAI must announce. What can that be? So I start with you, John, again. Or if you need some time to think, maybe I'll start with one thing. And with your permission, I'll record.
Okay, so only if you promise that
Yes,
right? So I have the fortune of traveling to many different parts of the world and I work with many different colleagues. And everywhere I go, I see huge energies, innovative words, and so forth. But they are all struggling. They're all in small, independent, peak work that find no resources and financial support and so forth. Red Lake is very powerful, and I believe it's moving more powerful because of the kind of coalition that you're building. So the message I was saying is that we're in many regional initiatives. Let's find a way to help each other out, collaborate, support each other as a local initiative, but as a global network. So that would be a goal towards this so-called universal access.
Necesitamos llevar los beneficios del acceso abierto. Hay más vulnerabilidad en ciertas partes que en otras. Y no es lo mismo consultar el conocimiento en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México que en la Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas. Los principales usuarios de Redalic muchas veces son de provincias fuera de las grandes ciudades, y eso se nos olvida. Para realmente lograr un derecho, un acceso universal a la información, tenemos que tomar en cuenta todas estas beneficiarios del acceso abierto, y donde la discusión a veces es muy académica, pero el usuario final que consulte, que es un alumno indígena en una comunidad mexicana en Bolivia, y que puede acceder, y que eso no se contabiliza porque no hay una forma contable de decir cuánto cuesta haberle llevado ese artículo científico a esa persona que no había tenido otra manera de poder acceder. Llevar y no olvidar al usuario final de las plataformas, de las infraestructuras, y valorar realmente lo que significa el acceso. Me parece que eso es algo que las discusiones se nos olvidan, y no hay que perderlo. Son 55.000 usuarios que consultan diariamente Redalic, y muchos vienen de comunidades totalmente marginadas. Entonces, para llevar el acceso universal tenemos que pensar siempre en que el usuario final, en el estudiante, en el profesor, que debe ser de alguna forma valorado ese acceso de alguna manera para poder ser equiparado con este ecosistema entre comercial y no comercial, y poder dar un valor exacto y un peso, porque al final ese es el objetivo final de la accesibilidad.
My message will be very short, actually. If I unpack all the arguments that I could muster in favor of open access, they ultimately lead to the same end, which is better, faster, more reliable knowledge. And I think in this age in our history, we're all concerned about the status of truth and our relationship to reality. That's why open access is so important.
Yes. Okay. ¿Puedes entenderme? Sí. Bueno, me gustaría apoyar el mensaje de Leslie. Tenemos que hacer una coalición. Me parece que UNESCO puede jugar un papel esencial en ese marco.
think there is someone has a very pressing question, but that's the last question, and after that, we're going to end. So. Because we have got exactly 3 minutes left.
Solo quiero hacer dos comentarios. Uno es un poco en la dirección de Wilson, decir que en la Universidad de Antioquia en Colombia, yo trabajo allí, este año no se compró Web of Science, pero realmente no ha salido de las bases de datos. Y mis estudiantes, los estudiantes de sociología, yo les muestro todas las bases de datos para que hagan sus búsquedas. Y los trabajos, la mayoría los entregan con realidad. Es la fuente, o sea, es la fuente de ciencias sociales en América Latina. Lo segundo es que quería solo comentar un poco frente a esto que estaban discutiendo en el panel, y pienso que también es muy importante el papel de la cooperación. En lo que hemos ido conversando con distintas universidades, ahora tratando de apoyar a Bélgica, los equipos que se van formando, con cada universidad que hablamos, y que sé que ha hablado Ardo, sé que ha hablado Ariana, pero que también los miembros del equipo hemos ido hablando, todos, cada una de las universidades dicen en qué apoyamos, cómo lo hacemos para entrar, pues de qué forma podemos ir construyendo algo operativo. Es difícil porque los presupuestos son limitados, etcétera, pero pienso que hacer realidad esto tendría el papel más importante, es que también se pueda empezar desde las propias universidades a generar plataformas cooperativas. Cada universidad tiene un servidor, las universidades tienen gente que es especializada en ciertos temas, en fin, la cooperación, estas cosas que otras no pueden hacer. Eso quería comentar. Gracias.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful, 2 hours, and I think a very productive one as well. From my organization's point of view, I can also make a couple of announcements. We'll continue to work with America and Red. We will work with you to somehow come about with this new assessment system. We will do that. The other thing that we will do is, and I think the Canadian planners will also join in this debate, we will in fact take your voice to the ambassadors of all countries of Latin America and Canada. So what we will do is we'll organize a session, and if you can come, we will in fact invite you, you can also come there. So I think what we want to do is we want to have that direct communication channel established between you and the government. And after that, I think the ball will be in their court. And then maybe some new mechanism will develop for us to take America and Redelic to the next level of attraction. Viva America! Thank you so much.